welcome to React Native Radio, episode 105. I'm your host, Nader Dabbit. Today on our panel, we have Peter Pikarczyk.
Hello.
And our special guest today, joining us again, is Eric Vicenti. Eric, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Nader. Hey, Peter. It's great to be back.
Great to have you. It's been, I guess, about a year and a half or something like that since you've been on. So a lot has happened since then. So this should be a fun discussion.
Totally.
So can you kind of give us an update on what you're doing, I guess, at the moment? I guess last time we talked to you, you were working at Facebook. And since then, you've changed your career and stuff like that. So why don't you just bring us up to date with what you're working on and, not only at work, but away from work, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I've left Facebook partially primarily to reorient my work towards what the community needs rather than what Facebook needs, which is pretty exciting for me, but it's of course a kind of a crazy transition. And one of those things that I've been paying a lot of attention to, aside from navigation, as I'm sure you're aware, is I've been looking at sort of what else is blocking people from being able to build apps really quickly, both on React Native and the web. And so I've been spending a lot of time working on a database system that is not really too ready to talk about, but I have been taking a look at some of the concerns in data handling when it comes to React Native apps and React web apps. But I've actually been spending a lot of time working on navigation and really bringing React navigation to the point that we thought it should always be at when it comes to stability and customizability. I'm just really excited to be back, working on this project with Brent and with the support of Expo. It's come a long way, and I'm excited to just keep on charging forward with it.
Yeah, we now have a first-class React Native navigation library that's continuously being maintained, that has a future. It's really nice, actually, because for a while it was one of those things that was just like a question mark. So it really feels awesome, to have something like that. Can you kind of talk about the decisions that were made, between, I guess, when React navigation was kind of in limbo, I guess, and then up until now, was there I guess some type of, someone made a cognizant decisions hey, we need to spend some time getting this project together?
Yeah, it's really been Expo who's been pushing it forward, because Facebook doesn't use React navigation. They have more complicated hybrid navigation solutions that are, great for them because they have this, army of native engineers that are capable of doing this. But for Expo, where developers trust React Native for the full screen, it's really been a big need, because there hasn't been a very clear solution other than React navigation. So Expo has recognized this and has been pouring some excellent resources into it. And by resources, I mean, I've been working with Brent, and Brent has really been pushing the project forward and does a great job with community management and helping, prioritize the roadmap and making sure that the library is pretty well documented and easy to use for people. So it's really Expo that's been making it happen, and I've been contracting with them sort of in my spare months to push it forward. So if you're going to thank anyone, thank Expo.
That's awesome, man. Expo does so much, it seems with React Native these days. Oh, yeah. I don't even know if React Native would be even near to what it is right now if it wasn't for Expo, actually.
Totally.
And they're very community driven too, where sometimes, people draw projects into their own company. Expo does a really good job of supporting the community by offering the React community and React Native community GitHub orgs, which I personally really appreciate.
Definitely.
So what are some of the major things, I guess, that have changed in the navigation library over the last 6 to 8 months that you want to talk about?
Sure, yeah. The navigation library started off as this, incredibly ambitious project where not only were we going to handle things like URLs, things like linking in your application, but we're providing a bunch of user interface to do it, right? We provide the stack navigator, which gives you the header component and the animations between screens when you do a normal push. But it also includes things like the tab bar, including, animated and swipeable tabs, things like the drawer. And a lot of these things are basically really complicated views, but they're also need to integrate with navigation logic. So because they integrated with navigation logic, we kind of had to release everything all together, all at once. But the way it's been built from the beginning is that it's been extensible and flexible. So we've been decoupling some of these larger, more complicated components like drawer, tabs, and the navigation stack. We've been taking them out of navigation core, not only so that they can be better maintained in their own independent repos, but so that people can feel more free to customize and to really own these components inside of their app. So this is sort of one of the directions that React Navigation has been going in. It's being a little bit more decoupled. So for V2 right now, there's several components. In fact, all of those components that I mentioned have been removed from React Navigation core. And right now they're dependencies that we don't break anybody. But in V3, you're going to be importing these things separately. So we've released sort of V1 at the beginning of the year, and that's kind of when we started really maintaining it really strongly again. And then we released V2, which helps some of the design issues around how React Navigation fits together. So it kind of enabled this a little bit better. And with V3, we do actually plan on making these components separate components. So if you want to create your own drawer, create your own stack, or if you want to fork one of these things, you can do it a lot more easily. And that kind of leads me well to the next project that we're thinking about with React Navigation V3, which is an improved transitioner that allows you to define the animations of just your current screen, rather than having to define the animations of all of the screens and how you might want to transition between them. So I'm pretty excited about this new transitioner project because it's going to let people really tap in to the power of React Navigation and let them just write a few animated views that define what it's like for a screen to open and to close, and potentially even how it could be closed with a gesture.
That is really nice. I remember actually specifically being on a project that was using React Navigation. I think this was maybe towards the end of 2017. And we ran into an issue where we wanted to define a screen-specific transition. And I forgot what we did, but it was really, really hacky. And this would have been awesome to have.
Definitely.
So with this new transitioner, which sounds really exciting, is that going to utilize React Native gesture handler?
Yeah, actually, that's one of the main reasons why the old transitioner was so difficult to work with, is because it managed transitions in kind of the old way. And the contract is changing, has evolved a little bit. So React Native Gesture Handler is one of the really exciting things because it allows us to get 60 frames per second animations and gestures, and most importantly, it allows us to animate at 60 frames per second at the end of a gesture, which can be one of the trickiest things to do when you're trying to implement really smooth UIs on React Native. And this is a big problem we have on navigation because of the swipe back gesture and because of things like the drawer, where people expect the momentum of the gesture to carry forward into the animation. So React Native Gesture Handler really, really paves the way. And this new transitioner, although I don't have it integrated with Gesture Handler yet, this is definitely one of the core things that we're going to be supporting, because Gesture Handler is kind of the future from my perspective. And I think it's going to be reasonable for this new transitioner to depend on Gesture Handler, or to at least enable Gesture Handler based, transitions and screens inside of your app.
That's awesome. I'm particularly very excited about it as well. When it comes to the different types of navigators, right, like Stack Navigator and Drawer Navigator, will this sort of abstract the idea of a Stack Navigator, for example, and let developers easily create their own? I can't think of an example, but imagine if there was a drawer Stack Navigator, right? For whatever weird reason, will this give developers the ability to create their own type of navigator and apply that transition across every screen within that stack?
In a sense. So if you want to create your own type of navigator, that's possible in today's API. It's just not very well known on how to do that. But this transitioner is quite exciting to me because it's going to allow you to define just one screen in your stack, or define one animation inside of your stack. Now, it is possible, though, that this new transitioner will grow to meet the use cases that the old views and the old transitioners did. But it's not necessarily designed with those constraints in mind. And it's kind of resulted in a better API, if you ask me. For example, in the Stack Navigator, one of the trickiest things that we sort of struggled with on the initial implementation is on the iOS back gesture. We need to be animating the screen backwards, right? So the top screen is moving as your finger moves from the left edge of the screen. But it's not just the top screen that moves. It's also the screen behind it that needs to move totally synced up to how your finger moves. So in that case, it wasn't super obvious for us because we needed to animate several of the different screens inside of the stack. So creating one API that would basically let you define the gesture for the top screen didn't make perfect sense. So I'm kind of abandoning that constraint for now on the new transitioner because the main use case for the new transitioner is something that people ask for all the time, but we don't really support super well, which is modals, right? When you want to have like a screen come up over other things. And in that case, it's very common that you might want to have a different design for each different modal that you have. And if you think about it, the first screen in the stack doesn't necessarily even need to be defined as a modal because it's the thing that covers the full screen. It's in the background. So we're kind of starting from the modal use case, and we're going to let it, grow naturally into the other use cases. But ultimately, I think it would be amazing if we could use this new transitioner to implement something like Stack, because Stack is this really complicated implementation right now. And a lot of that complexity sort of surrounds the header that we support on iOS.
Yeah, absolutely. That is exciting. So I and the rest of the folks listening have a better understanding. Will that allow folks to navigate like modals in like from the top or the bottom or the right and just like sort of like up here too, right? Are those sort of the things that we'll be able to do in a much more convenient way?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're going to be able to start from an existing React Navigation app. If you have an existing navigator that basically is a modal stack, it's currently configured as like a vertical mode transition for Stack Navigator because you can think of it as a vertical stack of navigation screens. If you have that, you can just change it to this new navigator. And then for each one of your screens, basically you are responsible for rendering the animation, which means that you're going to be rendering a component that either is something that you design yourself or something that comes out of one of the navigation libraries. And it's going to include itself. You're going to be rendering the component that does all of the animations and gestures for your screen. So you're going to literally have control over it in a way that you didn't before.
Awesome. So if you wanted to, you could create a stack that, for example, has a screen that appears instantly, right? With like no transition whatsoever. It just appears above the current screen, right?
Yeah, that's the default transition, which is no transition. It just instantly appears.
That's awesome. I can think of some cool use cases for that, I think.
Totally. I mean, the idea is, as you were saying earlier, if you want to have like a modal that comes in from the left sometimes and the right some other times, you might want to specify, modal direction with a prop. So this is going to allow that.
So you were talking about React Native Gesture Handler a moment ago. Let's step back and can you kind of talk about what that is for people that are listening that maybe haven't seen it or haven't been keeping up with what's going on and like why it's going to be put into the React Native framework in the future?
Definitely. It's interesting because the touch system that React Native uses right now, Pan Responder, was actually developed alongside the initial navigator, which is kind of how the existing navigation code, it's what we evolved from. So the original navigator inside of React Native, a lot of people don't know this, was written by Jordan Walk, the creator of React. And he was prototyping React Native stuff, and specifically he was prototyping the touch responder system, the Pan Responder system that we all use to negotiate touches inside of our app. And for those of you who don't use it, it's basically a set of props, a set of handlers that you can put onto Vue that describe how that view responds to touches. So whether or not that view wants to claim responsibility or claim responder of that touch based on sort of a touch starting or a touch moving, it's able to return true from one of those hooks and say that, yes, I want to own this touch. And then the rest of the screen will let that single component manage the touches for this interaction. And that's a pretty powerful model that was kind of inspired from iOS. But one difficulty from that model is that in order for that touch to really claim responsibility from other native components like scroll views or other components inside of your app, it needs to tell the main thread, it needs to tell code that's sitting on the UI thread that it wants to claim that gesture. But it can't do so synchronously because of React Native's architecture. So this is one of those things that is being investigated by some of the core React Native folks. But as a result of that, it's meant that it can be very difficult to implement touches that basically fight with the scroll view. So if you wanted to have one of those scroll away screens, like a screen that kind of comes from the bottom and then you just swipe it away by scrolling up really fast and the whole screen should go down, that's a pretty tricky circumstance to handle with Pen Responder, because you have the scroll view who's trying to claim responsibility for that touch on the UI thread, and you have your application code, your navigation code that tries to claim responsibility for that touch to dismiss it on the JavaScript thread. But by the time JavaScript is aware that this is happening, the touch is already given to the scroll view on the UI thread. So it's kind of too late for JavaScript in that case. And this has been a big pain point because it's sort of blocked off certain types of gestures that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So that's why Christoph Magiera, former React Native core team member who I worked with at Facebook, he's working with Expo on this really exciting project called React Native Gesture Handler. And that makes it so that you can kind of, it does away with Pen Responder and lets all of that interplay between the different things that you can touch on the screen. It lets all of that happen on the UI thread. So it's all going to remain responsive even if JavaScript is choking. So this is what React Native Gesture Handler is, and it lets you have very high-level components to accept certain types of gestures. Like there's a tap handler and there's a double tap handler. And you might ask, well, why do you need a double tap handler? Because if you have a single tap, you could just wait for that to be recognized twice, right? Well, you don't actually want that because your application code is going to be doing something different based on single tap versus double tap. And you want the single tap to only really be recognized after the double tap handler has not been recognized. So if you have a view that has just a single tap, you want it to be recognized right away. But if it also has a recognizer for double tap, you actually don't want to fire the handler for the single tap until you can tell that there isn't a second tap happening. So this is the sort of complicated stuff that it does for you entirely on the UI thread and allows you to very declaratively say, this is a double tap recognizer, or this is even a triple tap recognizer, whereas this is a swipe recognizer. So the swipe recognizer is what we're going to be using on React Navigation pretty eminently, and that is going to say, once the finger is down and is moving a certain number of pixels that you're able to configure, then it's going to claim responsibility for that touch. And JavaScript is going to get all of the events from these touch events, but it's actually not going to be able to interrupt, which is what it kind of claims to be able to do with a Pen Responder API. So hopefully that's a quick introduction to how Gesture Handler is an alternative touch system that really works, with Pen Responder. So it actually it can be dropped into part of your application and still work, which I think is fantastic. And one of the reasons we're going to be able to adopt it.
So that's interesting. At first, I thought this was built on top of Pen Responder, but apparently this is just a completely separate implementation. Is that right? So it's basically it's like if you install this right now, you're installing some native code, and you have to actually, link the code to get it working. Is that right?
Yeah, but it's done in partnership with Expo. So by far the easiest thing to do is use Expo, and in fact, you can use Expo Snack or something like that to get up and running really quickly with Gesture Handler. But it is a native implementation, and it does actually play nice with Pen Responder though, which I think is just really important for us to be able to adopt it, because we already have a lot of code written with Pen Responder, and if we have if we want to have a hope of adopting something new, we're going to need to be able to adopt it in bits and pieces. So that's why I think Gesture Handler is a pretty exciting future.
So is gesture handler already part of React Native 56 or a new version of Expo, or is it still not yet implemented?
It's been released as inside of new versions of Expo. And
Okay,
it's not
so
part
it's
of
in
React Native
Expo,
Core,
but not in React Native Core.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
I think it's been part of Expo since SDK 23. I think that sounds about right. Like it's been at least 3 or 4 versions, and I remember when it was in danger zone for a while, and I think now it's hit the stable branch. So you can start using it today without any issues.
Yeah, definitely 100 times the Expo recommendation there, because it's just going to work out of the box. And they've been pushing this forward the whole time. So yeah, they've been shipping early versions of Gesture Handler as part of Expo. And another really exciting thing that's right along that same track that Christoph is also doing is a project that he introduced at React Europe this year called Reanimated. And it's actually a fresh implementation of React Native's animated library that takes a lot of these learnings and is kind of a simpler system, but it provides different primitives than the animated library. Really, just more primitives. It's basically a scripting language. It's kind of like a Lisp that you're writing from JavaScript. Kind of like how you would use animated.add if you wanted to have 2 values that were basically turned into a style as part of your animation. When you're using animated.add, like that's not really JavaScript. You're not using the plus symbol as if you were doing addition inside of JavaScript. And the reason why is because that addition needs to happen every frame on the UI thread without JavaScript really being able to interrupt and do that work. And Reanimated takes that to the next level, where you're not just able to add 2 values and to interpolate 2 values, but it's actually a full, it's a Turing-complete language where you're manipulating these values on the UI thread based on descriptions of how you want this behavior to work from JavaScript. So I think Gesture Handler, and so on the current versions of Expo, you can actually play with Reanimated in addition to Gesture Handler, and they work really well together because of this.
Holy crap, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild. Like, this is kind of what I was dreaming. I've been thinking about this for a while because this feels so weird sometimes to use the animated library, because it feels kind of like a language, like it wants to be a language. It has a few language-like features, but it was very incomplete, and that the fact that it was incomplete would kind of prevent us from doing pretty wild things that could potentially define how animations and gestures work on the UI thread. And I think the other exciting thing, the thing that I think is just kind of nice, is that with Reanimated, a lot of the implementation is simpler for the animated library. For example, I believe interpolate. It's a very common thing if you use the animated library. You take some value that could be some new animated value that goes from 0 to 1. And you actually, you're presenting some styles. You're rendering some styles inside of your animated view. And you want to interpolate. You want to say that as this value goes from 0 to 1, do these other things. As it goes, up until 0.5, go to that value. And then up until 1, go to another value. Now, this interpolate function is actually pretty high level. So what Christoph has done is he's actually implemented interpolate in JavaScript. And what goes over to the UI thread is more of these animated values, these reanimated nodes, that is effectively like a Lisp language, which is basically saying if the value is less than 0.5, then do this linear interpolation. Otherwise, do this other linear interpolation. So in order to do that, Reanimated has basically an if statement in Reanimated. It's actually called cond. So, just like how you would use animated.add traditionally, they have reanimated.cond, which is conditional. And then you pass that a Boolean. If it's 1, then use, the first value, otherwise use the second value. So out of these primitives, what's great is now the native implementation for something like interpolate isn't even there. A lot of the complexity with the animated library is implementing a lot of this high-level stuff like interpolate in both Java and C++ or C. I'm not quite sure how it's done these days. But the native implementation was pretty complicated. So because Reanimated has much simpler primitives, like it's just cond, like cond is a lot easier to implement in the native code. And now we can have higher level implementations that are defined from JavaScript and shipped over to native, when they're needed.
So that sounds pretty amazing. I'm kind of curious now because I've heard of this library. I haven't even used it yet. Are there, so you were talking about the similarities. Is there still things like animated timing, animated parallel, and all of that stuff, or is that kind of rewritten as well?
Yeah, so animated.timing actually was missing for a little while there. So you wouldn't be able to do, this really easy, create a new timing and then do .start on it. That was kind of missing from Reanimated, but I think in the most recent version they fixed that, so just so that they can support the existing API, so that you can have just like animated.spring and then do .start on that.
So if you weren't going to be using timing, is there like another new API that's like a little different that you probably would prefer to use in this library?
Well, most of the time I think you're going to want to use that because it still is the sort of easy to use API. But there are some more powerful things under the hood that you could potentially use. Like there's a new concept of clock. So you can create basically a new clock, which is basically an animated value that you can start and stop on the native thread. So JavaScript will request that you now start or stop this clock. And on the native thread, it will continuously basically add milliseconds at the rate of time to this animated value. So then based on that animated value that's now changing very quickly, it's just an integer of the milliseconds since you've started it, you can now take that value and add it and subtract it and pass it into the rest of your reanimated nodes to output whatever other logic that you want.
It's also worth noting, too, that there's a lot of great examples in the React Native gesture handler GitHub repo. Things like swipeable rows and like Tinder swipe cards and, swiping things in like a scroll view. That's where I learned a lot about how it works myself. I don't really know much about Reanimated yet, but for gesture handler, it's been a fantastic resource.
Yeah, I agree. I would say that for Reanimated as well, diving into the examples is one of the first steps, and that it's kind of one of the only steps because it's kind of undocumented right now. I think, they're working on getting it fully feature complete. But if you want to sort of take a look at what it's like to use and see the progress on feature completion, it's the examples folders is definitely the place to keep your eye on, because last week or whatever when I was asking Christoph about it, that's when they were adding animation.start or timing.start, and so that had changed to the examples folder right around that time.
So as far as we've kind of gone over some of the stuff that you've been working on and that you're excited about as far as React Native is concerned, maybe we can talk about, just to kind of get your thoughts about the discussion around the re-architecture of React Native, the framework in general. And I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on some of those decisions that are kind of being made and where you think that's going to lead the React Native community in maybe a year from now.
That's a great question. I'm really excited to see that React Native Core is continuing to move really fast. And this is one of the big advantages of having a company like Facebook owning React Native Core rather than it being a community project. Because if you didn't have a really strong engineering team behind React Native, you wouldn't be able to do really radical fundamental changes in our infrastructure, which is what they're attempting with React Native Fabric. And the main concern that they're trying to fix is that one of the aspects of React Native's API or the way that React Native works, is that JavaScript and the native code are only ever talking to each other asynchronously. They're just kind of passing messages to each other. They're never waiting on each other. And that's kind of the way that it was designed. And most of the time, I would say that's how you want it to work. But every once in a while, for things like these touch interactions, or for things like rendering things really quickly, like in a scroll view that you're swiping really, really fast, it can be basically, very, very difficult or pretty much impossible to do this if you're not able to call into JavaScript from the native code. So that's what React Native Fabric is really trying to address, is making it so that it's possible to directly call JavaScript functions from native code. And again, I would say that a lot of times that's not really what you want to be doing, because this async behavior that React Native has is quite ideal and does lead to really good performance a lot of the time. And one of the reasons why historically it would have been a really bad idea to call synchronously from the native code into JavaScript is it would have been a bad idea because JavaScript often takes a really long time to render something. Like when you're rendering something in React land, not only is React rendering, the component that's changing, but all of the children components. It's calling render on all of that whole tree of components. And historically, React has only ever been able to do all of that work in one frame, all of it at once, basically. And that would lead to some pretty bad behavior if you wanted to have your native code wait for JavaScript to do something. But the React team has been aware of this for a really long time. They've been really on top of this. So that's why they actually rewrote React several years ago, as part of this whole React 16 rewrite or React Fiber. And Fiber really unblocks this. It implements a new architecture for React and allows React to schedule its own work and say that certain updates are really important. Like if there's a native thread that's waiting on a certain chunk of rendering work, we've got to do that right away. Meanwhile, if something isn't going to show up on screen for a few hundred milliseconds, then we can sort of defer that. Or maybe if the native code is asking for UI asynchronously, well, then it's not quite as high priority and we could potentially do a little bit more work. But it's really React Fiber that has unblocked React Native Fabric. So it's pretty spectacular for me, who's been somewhat close to it, but hasn't been part of the teams actually doing it, to see them, embark on this many year engineering effort to improve some of these core aspects of React Native's architecture. And a lot of these issues are sort of visible first and foremost within large companies that have hybrid applications, because in a hybrid application, you've got all sorts of native code that you're writing that you might want to interface with React Native. So you're going to see this problem a lot more. And this is definitely one of those things that Airbnb had troubles with as well. And it's clearly been troublesome at Facebook when it comes to integrating into the main app. But it's incredibly exciting to see that in response to that, as opposed to throwing up their hands or as opposed to trying to create some wholly separate technology that was effectively competing with React Native, the React and the React Native teams have identified these issues, gone and unblocked them. This was several years ago when they're doing Fiber, and now finally we're able to cash in on some of that foresight that they had to really make it so that hybrid applications and really highly performance sensitive applications can do this. They can have the UI code wait on aspects of JavaScript. And that's going to unblock all sorts of different integrations on the hybrid app environment that we haven't seen before. And the primary one in that case is that if you can wait on JavaScript to render something, then you can figure out on the native thread how big it is, meaning you can mix and match native components and JavaScript components on the same screen, which has historically been pretty difficult.
Wow, that's awesome. You gave a really good explanation of all that, by the way. Thank you. I think I actually understand it much better now, even though I've been researching it for the last couple of months.
Yeah, same here. I've just been listening intently. That was a really good explanation.
Yeah, and I had no idea that Fiber and Fabric even had anything to do with each other.
Yeah, I mean, on a very high level, it's hard to see why these things are related. But the React teams they've just been really paying close attention to these things, and partially because they've needed to, because the engineering constraints and demands at Facebook are really so intense. So if it seems that the React Native team is not being very responsive on React Native, it's not because they're not able to fix the community's issues, or it's not because they don't care. It's because they know that they're the only ones who are able to push React Native core forward. And if they aren't focusing on these big re-architecture projects like Fabric and Fiber, then we wouldn't be able, we would potentially be risking the whole community's success in the future. Whereas a lot of these, surface level issues that people are having with React Native, if there's an issue that stays open for months on the React Native, repo, and, maybe there's a way to work around it, or maybe there's a fix that people are doing in their own fork of React Native. Well, yeah, that isn't perfectly ideal, and it'd be great to have more engineering resources towards reviewing those pull requests. I'm still really glad that things are set up the way they are, because now Facebook is able to go and fix these things in core that just wouldn't otherwise be fixed if we did have normal, if the community did, was the only ones really contributing to React Native. So when you see people being unresponsive on GitHub, just keep in mind that they're often working on something that might even be a lot higher priority than the issue that you see that they might not be super responsive on.
Yeah, good point. I've seen a lot of that as far as the addressing of, or the non-addressing of certain issues, but then they come out, a few months later and they've built, or they're building something that's going to actually completely just make that issue like a non-issue in the first place, but they couldn't really discuss it. So
yeah, definitely. I think they've got their priorities in the right order when it comes to making sure that React Native core is really well engineered and it's going to be successful over the long term. And then once its viability is then proven at large companies like Facebook, then it's really never going to go away. And all of these little issues are things that we can shake out over time. And I know that it can be painful for people who are depending on certain aspects there, but I mean, this is open source. There is you're always able to fix an issue if you see it. It's just it can be a little bit of a struggle sometimes, but I think the React Native team has their priorities in the right order.
So before we wrap it up, you had mentioned that you were doing something else on the side around data management or something like that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. For me, it's always tough when somebody who's new to app development or new to website development asks, maybe they'd use Create React App, or maybe they'd use Create React Native App, but they learned a bunch of stuff to build an app, build some front end, and then they ask the next really obvious question, which is, how do I go and save data for this app? And every time that happens, and I can see it coming every time they're going to want this, and that it crushes me every time they ask that question because I don't have a good answer. The best answer that I have right now is to go use Firebase. And I think that that's the best answer right now because Firebase is so easy to use and get started with. But ultimately, I think it's an injustice to people who I tell that to, because even though I did say the best thing, I know in the back of my head that if their application is successful, they're likely to have to move away from Firebase over time because it's a black box. It's hard to optimize. You can't go in and see the code to it. You can't send pull requests to it. You couldn't host it anywhere outside of Google. So that's been frustrating to me for a while. And that's, right there alongside this other issue, which is that, once you decide that set state isn't enough for you, like where are you storing your application's data, even on the client? You can use MobX like state tree, you can use Redux, or you can use something like Apollo. But if you use, a GraphQL solution, then you need to go write a whole GraphQL server. And then you need to go learn Postgres or something like that on the back end. So this is like this enormous ball of complexity that I've really wanted to have better solutions to. So that is definitely a project that I'm working on. I'm working on basically like an open source Firebase that also has a client library. And once you sort of take that level of responsibility, I'm very excited for the use cases that we're able to unblock. For one, we can make it so that your whole application is real time by default, which means that your server knows when certain things need to get pushed to the client. We can also make it so that your client works completely while offline. It's able to, index things for search, even offline, and it's able to reflect the most up-to-date information everywhere in your application, even when it's offline. And that's going to require sort of a higher level database that lives not just on the server, but also on the client. So that's kind of like the high level scope of the project that I'm working on. And then from here on out, it's been largely a question of, how can I do this in a practical way that will not just help the community right now and not just be a solution, but, if I create something and then throw it over the wall and don't maintain it, then it's, almost as bad as never having created it in the first place. So I want to make sure that when I do have a solution here, it's going to be a solution that I'm comfortable maintaining and recommending over the long term. So one of the things that I've been doing is trying to sort of align my incentives with what people in the community need. So I've gone and got myself placed at a new startup that's building web apps, mobile apps, and other surfaces. And there needs to be a really simple database for them to use, because we've really just got to be moving fast. So this is why so now I think I've got my incentives aligned, where I'm able to be working on this problem in not just a way that I think is healthy for the community, but in a way that is sustainable for me, and also will prioritize the project in the right direction. Like, if I need to add an escape hatch for X, Y, or Z to make it so that I can ship right away, that's what I'm going to do, because we've got to ship. And this is the constraint that most of the world has. So these are the sorts of constraints that I want to have on my project to make sure that it's actually useful in the real world and not just a wild experiment that may or may not survive.
So when you say a database locally and remotely, is there something you can compare it to that's out there right now? Because what I'm thinking is, are you basically saying that you want to write locally and then that actual database will then write remotely, or do you write to both places at the same time? How does that work?
Yeah, I want to sort of unlock the full power of the database for the client developer. So if you're using something like MobX State Tree, that's kind of a similar concept to what I want, except I want that state to be able to be remote state, and I want to sort of be observing what's going on the back end, such that if any of the data changes inside of the whole graph on the back end, that it's able to go right away, make its way visible onto your app. But I'm trying to think of other libraries or databases that really take this responsibility. One example is using Couch on the back end and Pouch on the front end. It kind of allows you to model your data in such a way that it's going to work just as well when it's an offline application as when it's online. But there's a lot of other stuff that I hope to implement along the way to make it easier for people, so that you can say that a great example is supporting permissions. Like, every application has permission constraints. You don't want anyone to be able to write data, and a lot of data you want to have private. So you really do want that logic to live on both the client and the server, because on the client, you've got to show the user what they're able to edit and what they're not able to edit. And on the server, you definitely need it because you want to enforce those permissions. So this logic, where are you going to implement that? I don't know of many other solutions or really anything else that allows you to define your permissions, basically on the client effectively, with a little bit of server-side configuration for the initial stuff. And then just, pretend that you have a full server backend, but basically all of that logic, all of the business logic for what's happening on the server is defined as part of your client code base. And when you want to sort of have some of that business logic securely shipped to the server, well, you ship your database effectively out of your front-end code base. You literally share that business logic as code. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what I've been thinking about there.
Yeah, the permissions thing is pretty interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. So I'm guessing that the setup has to be, I guess, similar across both the client and the server, and maybe even the API.
Yeah, definitely. The API is going to be very constrained. It's going to be at the beginning. It's going to be like an untyped JSON document database. And I'm saying untyped not because I don't want types desperately, but because I need to simplify the hell out of it in order to ship initially. Ultimately, I want there to be a really robust type system that's sort of built into the database. So that way you'd be able to kind of, infer your GraphQL schema or something like that, or just have intelligence and validation around the shape of the data in your database. But I've really just got to cut a lot of corners if I'm going to get this thing out the door. And the type system is one of those things, because I can implement the full permission system without types. So basically what that means is that the client is going to be able to publish any document to the document. It's just going to be JSON. And that might not necessarily make sense for the rest of your application, but you can still validate permissions and say, does this user have access to that to write to that document? So these are the sorts of things that I've been thinking about when it comes to, how can we simplify the hell out of shipping, real database driven applications that work great on the client and the server and offline, without having developers having to learn a ton of server technology.
So when do you think that you'll have something like this prototyped out for people to try out? Or is this going to be even something that you're going to make available?
Yeah, I definitely plan on making this available, but until it's something that is working for me in my very limited use case, I don't really expect to be documenting it or promoting it too far. The source code is technically public, and it kind of will always be and has always been. And it's part of this broader Avon Cloud initiative. So on GitHub, it's Avon Cloud/globe. And this is this really messy kind of monorepo that not only has this database project, but it has all of the infrastructure for my new realm of work. And it's all very tightly integrated, and some of it's very messy. I'm not super proud of the stuff that hasn't been isolated into its own bits yet. And for me, the reason I'm sort of publishing this monorepo is because a lot of this stuff is stuff that other people face as well. I'm basically spinning up, virtual servers on DigitalOcean, but, I could potentially support other things. And, a lot of these people sort of need, the ability to build a full front end that automatically, has a database and put it on their own infrastructure. And even though none of this stuff is very well documented right now, all of the code is out there, and hopefully I'll be able to attract other greenfield projects and say that hey, if you're doing something new and you want to be able to target web and mobile, then you could start here and we could all work on this together, even if it's messy, because it is one thing, one sustainable project, rather than hundreds of little repos where you don't really know what the heck is going on, then at least it's one thing to keep our eye on and to continue iterating on. Because for a while now, I've been, in very limited hacky situations, I've been able to share code with web and mobile and, have the same component render on iPhone, Android, the web server, and the web client. But I've never really been able to launch that as a very sustainable thing. And that's kind of bothered me because that's not really what I'm focusing on. I've been focusing on navigation, which is one section of this whole thing. And I also have to fix this database situation for this next company. So when it comes to all the infrastructure surrounding that ties everything together, it's kind of messy. It's not something that's like really that clean yet. But if I have a hope to sort of move forward, the way that I think it's going to happen is by me just staying persistent on this one repo, and this is my new monorepo for now. So that's a place that people can sort of keep an eye on it, but it's not going to be very usable for a while. So if you want to take a look at it and ask me questions about it, I'm all there. But when it comes to other people using it, I would really ask that you don't use it unless you're willing to help own it and take full responsibility of everything that's there.
Really cool. It sounds like a really ambitious project, so I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. And it sounds like something that would be really useful, actually.
I'm excited. Finally, all my wheels are turning pointing the same direction here, which is that I've got a target full stack environment where I want to be able to make apps, websites with a full cloud backend. And now it's just a matter of doing it. I've kind of broken the problem down into 3 pieces. The first piece is sharing code with React on the front end and mobile in the back end. And that's, doable right now, just a little bit painful. The second is navigation, which, I've been working on navigation and I'm hoping to sort of increase my web support for React navigation. And lastly, of course, there's the database. So this is kind of the next frontier for my endeavors.
Very cool. Well, thanks for coming on. I think we'll go ahead and jump to the picks now. Do you have any picks for the show today?
When you start a new project, typically you need things like a domain name, hosting, things like that. When I choose hosting, I pick mine for the options it gives. I like to know what I'm getting and set things up just how I like them. This is why, for your projects, you should check out Linode. Linode servers feature native SSD storage, a 40 gigabyte network, and Intel E5 processors. That's all the power you need to run VMs under full control, or Docker containers, who doesn't love that, encrypted disks, and VPNs. Plus, they have 10 data centers across the world and add-ons like backups, Node Balancer, and Longview to help you control your server costs. They also offer block storage for your static files, And you can get started with a $20 credit if you use the code ReactNative2018. That credit is good for 4 months on their 1 gigabyte server. That's a lot of time to try them out and see if they're the right fit for you. That code again is ReactNative2018. Also, if you're interested in working for Linode, they're hiring. Head to linode.com/careers to see their available positions.
Oh yeah. So I don't know how many of you watch cable news or sort of, let that happen to you. But in the past year, I've kind of discovered Vice News and Vice News Tonight, which to me has just been pretty fabulous because it's a totally different format for news. Rather than talking heads that are often just saying a lot of their own opinions rather than doing the journalism, like the people on Vice News seem to really be going out there and just getting a lot of really good content and really relevant stuff, both in U.S. news and in the world. So I would definitely recommend Vice News Tonight if you have HBO.
Very cool. I have watched it, by the way. I like it. There's not a lot of decent news these days, right?
Right. Seriously.
So I have 2 picks. The first one is Chicago JS. It's the Chicago JavaScript conference that's coming up in September. Tickets are pretty cheap. It's like $150. So it's a pretty good deal, and I believe all of the profits are actually going to a good cause. So if you're interested in going to a good conference that's not going to, break your budget, definitely check out Chicago JS. And my other pick is a tutorial site that I've been using lately called A Cloud Guru, and it basically teaches you how to use cloud services. So I work at AWS, and I'm kind of learning a bunch of stuff these days, but some of the stuff I'm really interested in is around some of the AI and machine learning services, but also serverless and Lambda functions in general, and looking to learn how to work with things like Alexa and things like that. So there's a lot of good content on this website. I think it's like a subscription though, like $30 a month, but I'm basically going to probably subscribe for maybe another month or 2 and watch all the courses I'd like and then probably unsubscribe. But either way, it seems like a pretty good deal. So if you're interested in learning any of that stuff, I would definitely check out A Cloud Guru. I think they also have a Medium blog with some pretty good content as well. All right. Well, yeah, totally. Thanks again for coming on. I think this was one of the better discussions we've had lately. We covered a lot of interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Nader. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks for listening. This has been episode 105 of React Native Radio, and we'll see you next week.